Welcome to Voice by Vinexposium, where the global wine and spirit community shares insights, stories, and expertise. Voice is your platform, your stories, and your voice.
Hello, I'm Anne Burchett, wine marketing and communication specialist, and this is Voice by Vinexposium. Voice by Vinexposium deals with the topics that matter in the wine and spirits world. Today I'm talking to Julian Braithwaite, CEO and President of International Alliance for Responsible Drinking, Nadia Fritella, Secretary General of the Wine in Moderation Association, and Felicity, founder of the Drinks Insider podcast, research and content consultancy, as well as editorial editor of R&E Global. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
In the 50s, France was the first country to introduce guidelines on alcohol consumption. No more than a litre a day. A ludicrous amount by today's standards. By 2019, it was a maximum of 2 glasses a day, not every day. In the UK, the BMA stated in 2016 that no level of alcohol consumption is entirely safe. Last month, and following in the footsteps of the WHO in 2023, the US Surgeon General stated that consuming even 1 drink per week over a lifetime could significantly increase cancer risk. So the question is, can we protect our industry and how? Nadia and Julian, your organization are funded by the wine and spirits industry, yet your mission is to promote responsible drinking and curb excessive alcohol consumption. Is it possible to reconcile your aims and encourage responsible drinking with the fact you're funded by the industry?
Should I start?
Be my guest.
Well, obviously, yes, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. So Wine in Moderation first started in 2008. So it's been around for more than 15 years. It was the first time that this wine sector came together around one single program to encourage moderate and responsible drinking. And what started off as a 3-year commitment, which was in the frame of the European Alcohol and Health Forum, actually turned into an association, the Wine in Moderation Association, which aims to empower and encourage, empower wine professionals and encourage responsible consumption of wine. We are a membership organization, so we are funded by the wine sector in general. That is national wine associations, leaders of the wine sector, so ambassador companies, and partners, so anyone who is related to the wine sector. And we are a program for action, so we are funded by the sector and we are for the sector. That means that our goal is to empower wine professionals, give them the tools, best practices, everything that they need to include moderate and responsible drinking in their everyday lives. So whether it is in their communication, in wine tourism activities, in the wine tasting, anything. So we want really for this message to be incorporated in every aspect of the wine sector.
As a form of protection, anticipation.
I wouldn't call it a protection, rather than this is part of the wine sector. It should be a part of everything that we do and everything that we say, because wine is moderation. Is not, they go together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Julian?
So, unlike Wine in Moderation, we're broader. So the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking, in its modern form, really took shape about 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years ago. And its core companies are the 13 beer, wine, and spirits companies. They're all big international companies. But they came together in the aftermath of the UN strategy to reduce the harmful consumption of alcohol, which was agreed by the World Health Assembly in 2010. And these companies came together and their CEOs came together to make these pledges as the CEOs of 13 companies who represent quite a lot of the center of gravity in the industry, to say that they were committed to supporting this strategy. And so there isn't a contradiction between companies that have a business model that's about selling their products to people to consume moderately, and being absolutely supportive of all efforts to tackle the harmful use of alcohol. So current international policy, as set out by this UN strategy, differentiates harmful consumption from moderate consumption and targets all public policy interventions on the harmful consumption, because that's what leads to the health harms and other harms of alcohol consumption. And the companies and the CEOs of these companies know that this is essential to their business model as well, to their long-term sustainability, to their license to operate. And so they were committed to that. They came out with these producer commitments, as they were called at the time, and IARD has been taking that forward. And we, as you know, the clue's in the name, our job is to promote moderation, responsible drinking for those adults who choose to drink. One of the big things we've focused on, and the companies that our members have been focused on, has been to ensure that we tackle underage drinking. So that's been one of the big parts of what we've done. Promoting what moderate consumption means and responsible consumption means has been something that the companies have also been committed to. And moderation, wine has its own practice of moderation, beer has its own practice of moderation, so do the spirits sector. All sectors do it slightly differently, but they're all proud of actually how, you know, their products can be consumed safely, responsibly, moderately. And IARD promotes that, and the companies themselves promote what that means, including through their marketing. And then the third area where IARD and its standards focus is on how we support actually tackling the harmful consumption of alcohol. So supporting programs around the world that are tackling drink driving, supporting putting in place statutory measures like legal purchase ages, for example, in Cambodia recently. So these companies operate globally. They operate across all three categories, but they're all focused on how you can actually, as the industry, support in what the UN calls the whole of society approach, which brings together government, civil society, and the private sector, support the interventions that tackle the harmful consumption of alcohol, while accepting that moderate consumption, and that's been defined differently over the years, as you said, but that moderate consumption is low risk, and therefore public policy should focus on the harmful consumption, and that's how you really deliver progress in terms of tackling alcohol harms. And just a final point, the World Health Organization actually measures this, and there are these 4 UN indicators, and perhaps the most telling one is something called alcohol attributable mortality. And this is a UN indicator that the WHO measures. And they published data just last June showing that alcohol attributable mortality since 2010 fell by 20% between 2010 and 2019. So there's been real progress in terms of both this strategy, the results that it delivers, and the fact that it brings together the private sector, civil society, and governments working together.
Excellent. I think we're done. What comments would you make on that, Felicity? Have you ever had, in your role as an expert, a commentator, a journalist, have you ever had question about this element of, you know, the wine and spirit industry literally moderating itself?
Well, I have to say, before I started researching this topic, I had no idea about many of these organisations. It's been a complete surprise to me to discover that there's a whole new area of wine and spirits and beer as well, which I didn't know anything about. And what's been very interesting is how scientifically literate the organisation is. The spirits industry in particular retains a lot of very high-level scientific expertise to keep an eye on all of this and to understand what's true and what's not, which is very difficult because a lot of alcohol research is very confounding.
Okay. So if we look at the framework, you've explained how you work, but do you occupy all the space there is, or do you think there is room for other organizations? Or have we reached saturation point? And do you think that all the jobs that need to be done in that respect are done? This is slightly cheeky because obviously you could say, well, yeah, we're doing the job. Thank you very much.
Well, we're always happy to see new initiatives because obviously there is always a need to adapt to new markets, to adapt to new consumer trends. And well, I'm going to preach from my own choir here, but this is what we try to do through Wine in Moderation, in the sense that Wine in Moderation is the central program, but it can be adapted to national needs, you know, culture, legislation. So obviously, we're always happy to see the program being implemented in new markets. And we see it as a kind of a menu. So we develop all kinds of different tools and activities, whether it is training, communication campaigns, education and such. And according to the market needs, our members will pick and choose what they need, and they will take it from there and implement it in their markets.
So you could have a grassroots organization picking up from what you're devising and adjusting it to their needs.
Exactly.
Okay. So there is potential for mushrooming at the local level.
Yeah.
I think that's the key, and the IARD is an alliance, and that's the point. We're an organisation of 25 people, so of course, I would say yes, there's definitely scope for more resources to come into this space. And the way in which we work is actually by building an alliance with those organisations. Yes, we have our 13 companies, and they've got their big companies with lots of resources, and they put money behind this and put their people behind this, and that's very powerful. It's a real multiplier effect, and most of our effect is achieved through their activities, coordinated through IARD. But we also have a partnership council which brings together all of the, many of the trade associations in this industry, but also social aspect organisations that are working with governments around the world to support these programmes designed to both communicate moderation, also tackle harmful consumption. And many of them are national. There's some great examples around the world, and they're members of our partnership council. And so again, they coordinate through us, with us. We provide materials to support them. We have, coming back to the point about scientific capability, we have a science analysis team. We don't do research, we don't commission research, but we do analyse the science in order to tell our companies and our partners what's going on, and providing that sort of analytical basis, because the companies want to make sure that they're on top of the science. It's ultimately for governments and international institutions to decide what the regulatory framework is, but they want to know where they sit. They want to make sure that they're on the right side of all of that. And they don't, as I say, they don't commission their own science, but they do need to understand what it is, because it's very important.
Yeah. So we've established what you're doing and the fact that you have significant results, yet the clouds are gathering. And I absolutely loved your article last year in Wine Business Monthly, which I must admit I read it twice or 3 times, because sometimes you skim an article and you think, I've got the gist of that. But that one was so dense. I don't know how long it took you to research it, but
many months.
Yeah, it was, and it was so interesting. So I'm going to ask you an impossible task, but could you please summarize what the point of the article was and the main, the essential points, that the conclusion you came to?
Well, I had been talking to people about the WHO's advisory that there was no safe level of alcohol. And so I started just coincidentally looking at WHO documents. And I was surprised at how many partners they had. And so, because I'm slightly anal, I think, I started Googling the partners, and who they were really surprised me, particularly one called Movendi, which actually the Canadians had been writing about Movendi because they had discovered that when the Canadian, a group of Canadian scientists were tasked with revising the drinking guidelines in Canada, and when they published their results, they said only 2 drinks a week was risk-free, which caused a furore in Canada. But so a bunch of economists and other people went into the document to find out how they'd done it, and they looked into conflicts of interest and discovered that a number of the scientists had worked with this group Movendi. So I was like, well, who is Movendi? It turns out they are a historical temperance group that have reinvented themselves as a public health organisation, and now they're advising, or they're working with the WHO on WHO policy documents. And that the WHO had gone further than required. So as I understand it, Julian would know this better, but the WHO is supposed to be responsive to what member states are asking for. And they had done things that no member state did ask for, like a guide for journalists on how to report on alcohol, which was riddled with inaccuracies. So the more I looked at this, the more I thought, this is very strange. And then I stumbled into a whole world of anti-alcohol public policy, which I found very interesting.
They went beyond the call of duty, but they were pushed by organisations that had...
I couldn't say whether they were pushed or not, but they are in partnership with organisations that are avowedly anti-alcohol. And I think for a major public health body, that's a very interesting situation to be in.
Yeah. What about the link with tobacco, which I thought was very interesting as well?
So when I sat and I looked at some of these organisations, and I spent I became obsessed with it. What I discovered was two things. One is how many of the historic temperance groups have played this trick of turning themselves into what they call civil society organisations or public health organisations, so that they can get taxpayer money and they can look very respectable. But the other thing that... Sorry, what was your question?
The role of tobacco in people moving
So when I was looking at a lot of these organisations, particularly the European lobby organisations, is how many of their staff had come out of tobacco control. And this is true in academia as well, that there was a lot of money going into studying tobacco and studying tobacco control. And as I understand it, in the last decade or so, a lot of that money has dried up. And so people are widening their remit. And it's largely driven, I think, by the desire for grant money. So there's a very famous institute at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Health in the United States, which was called Tobacconomics. And in November, they changed their title to the economics of health, and now they've widened it to be alcohol, opioids, pharmaceuticals, whatever. The University of Bath had a tobacco unit that's become the Spectrum Consortium, which is looking at junk food and alcohol. So it's surprising how many of the public health lobbyists have this background in tobacco control, and I believe that they're bringing their tobacco control techniques to other areas.
Which mean that potentially labelling could change. All these things could happen that have happened to the tobacco industry.
Well, it's explicitly what they want. All of the so-called best buys from the WHO are pretty much tobacco control ideas. So get rid of alcohol from any marketing, sponsorship, advertising. Put warning labels on it. Remove it from. To pursue a strategy that is technically called denormalisation, to make it less normal for there to be alcohol around.
Marginalise it.
Yeah, so if you think about tobacco's not prohibited. You can go and buy cigarettes. Your problem is you can't smoke them anywhere. You can't smoke them here, you can't smoke them on trains, you can't smoke them anywhere, you can't smoke them in a pub. Now, this is one of the great public health victories of our age. I think we're all grateful we don't have to put up with the smoke. But eventually, if you can't see it around you and if you can't go anywhere and do it, you stop doing it. Yeah. And so it's very clear that there's a section of the public health lobby that are trying to do the same thing with alcohol, to remove it. So there's more articles, for example, about, I was just reading one today in a human resources journal about it's time to get alcohol out of Christmas parties because it discriminates against people who don't drink and it makes them uncomfortable. So that's a denormalisation tactic.
I think that's very important, and that I really wanted Felicity to explain all the research she'd done, because the way I look at it, maybe naively, is to see as a sort of background and almost a justification for all the work you are doing. Is that the right way to look at it?
I mean, look, I've been in this role for about a year, and I came into this industry after 30 years in diplomacy. I mean, one of the things that struck me the most, actually, coming into this field, was looking at the sort of the alcohol and public policy debate, was how politicised it felt. I mean, I started a year ago, and literally not a week would go past without a sort of a big piece in one of the major international newspapers talking about no safe level, or this other concept which is known as commercial determinants of health, which is basically a fancy way of saying that the industry should be excluded from all efforts. And these two concepts of no safe level and commercial determinants of health, when I understood the policy framework better, both of those hit at the two key pillars of current policy. Mm-hmm. The two key pillars of current policy, as set out in the 2010 UN strategy to reduce the harmful use of alcohol, is you focus on the harmful use of alcohol, i.e. there is a distinction between harmful use of alcohol and moderate use of alcohol. Mm-hmm. Now, if there's no safe level, then there's no distinction. Mm-hmm. So that undermines the intellectual foundation of current policy. The other basis pillar of the current policy is this thing, the whole of society approach, which brings together government, civil society and the private sector to work together. Now, commercial terms of health says you have to take the private sector out of that. So those are the two key pillars of current policy. As I was saying earlier, the WHO's own data suggests that the current policy is making global progress. I mean, it's not universal. There's plenty of examples where it's not going in the right direction, but that overall figure on the key indicator shows global progress. Why is it that people are saying you should undermine the current policy when
it's
the
working?
data suggests from the WHO that it's working? So I don't, I still haven't yet really come to a good answer as to why that's happened. But it comes back a bit to a point that Felicity made, which is, Movendi, which when you look into it has a rather distinguished temperance past, has an official relations with the WHO. So the WHO has a series of organizations that have an official status, an official relationship status with them. Movendi is one of them. I thought, how have they ended up with the temperance organization having official relations, and one that is now incredibly active within all the WHO policy debates, not just in WHO Geneva, which is where the global headquarters is, but in these very powerful and very independent WHO regional organizations. So like WHO Euro, which is based in Copenhagen, PAHO, which is the America's WHO regional organization based in Washington, DC. If you go to the meeting records of all of those meetings of those regional organizations, time and time again, Movendi will be popping up, advocating very hard to say there's no safe level and you should have commercial temps of health. How they've ended up in such a position of influence within the global public health institutions is something of mystery to me.
Will you come back and tell us when you find out?
If I could just jump in on the commercial determinants of health, which is a almost bizarre ideology. And it works like this. They've said tobacco was as dangerous as it was because, tobacco is inherently dangerous, but it proved to be a plague because tobacco companies were very cashed up and they paid for it to be a plague. So they paid off politicians, they put it into, film and marketing and, whatever, all of which was absolutely true. They paid money to distort the science on the harms of tobacco. So this part of the public health lobby, which is not the entirety of the public health lobby, by the way, there's a lot of people working in public health who, deal with alcohol in its myriad forms, and it's right and proper that they do so. I'm talking about this very specific anti-alcohol group. So they've come up with this idea that it was the profit-seeking behaviour of tobacco that made it so dangerous. And so they've come to the idea that all of the harms of alcohol or other industries are also primarily the result of the profit-seeking behaviour of companies. And so what they want to do is they want to analyse it. And it's a really strange ideology. But as part of that, they need to get the commercial sector out of anything to do with government or to do with whatever, because the fact that they're seeking profit makes them a polluting actor. So what they're asking for is they're asking for something that happened in 2003, which is the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control, where governments around the world agreed that they would never speak to tobacco people again, that they were completely banished. Now, there's no appetite for anyone to put another framework convention together. It took a long time and it's still not perfect and nobody's going to do it. But that is the result that they're looking for and they're pushing for.
I think part of, the history of the World Health Organization, when it was established, the treaty established it, allowed it to negotiate new treaties. They've only negotiated one, and that's the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It's one of the great successes of the WHO and the sort of, international public health. But it is sort of, when you have a hammer that looks like that, there is a risk that everything else starts looking like a nail. And I think that's what sort of happened with alcohol.
So you're trying to protect the nail?
Or actually, ensure that people realise that, it's not the same nail as the one they hammered on last time.
What's your view on that, Nadia?
Well, I'm not going to go into the specifics of policy because as Wine in Moderation, we are very specific that we are a program for action.
Yeah.
So we don't do any lobbying activities. We are really focused on giving the sector all the tools and knowledge that they need to make sure that the message comes through to the consumers.
But even though you're a program for action, surely you feel these headwinds coming your way?
We have, in the sense that a lot of the or an increasing number of people working in the sector have come to us.
Yeah.
So in that sense, yes, we felt it. So people are realize that
There is a threat.
There is a threat, and they want to make a difference.
Yeah.
So they come and they say, what can we do? And this is where we give them the tools and we say, well, we will help you get the message across.
Okay. A slightly disingenuous question. There was this fallacy circulating about 10, 15 years ago where wine people love to delude themselves. I sound like Robert Joseph now. And wine people were saying, yeah, but we're not the problem. The problem is spirits. Wine is good for you, and wine is fine, and wine will never be threatened. That's completely over, isn't it? What's your view on that?
Look, when people talk to me about this, the one thing they always say...
I thought you'd have an opinion on that.
No. So everybody wants to have a conversation with me about the health thing. And the one thing they all say is but why don't we tell them, as though there's a them you can go and talk to, why don't we tell them about the fact that we produce wine sustainably and we're not big alcohol, and we... sustainable is usually the number one thing that we, and that we make artisanal products and whatever. And I always say to them, okay, put the word carcinogen into your argument. How does it go? We've made our carcinogen for 8 generations. We make our carcinogen in the vineyard. The public health lobby looks at it as, or they're talking more about ethanol being a carcinogen, and there is no shield against this.
I mean, Felicity's right in that if you talk to the WHO and if you talk to epidemiologists, they're not distinguishing between different categories of alcohol beverage. They talk about ethanol. And they talk about the properties of ethanol and what that means for the body and carcinogenic effects of ethanol. So that is, it is true that each category, they're different products, they're consumed differently, and each of them, as I was saying earlier, have their own proud traditions of moderate consumption. Wine, is linked to certain ways of you serve it with meals, which is a good thing, etc., etc. The beer category has their own story to tell on this. Spirits talk about how they also consume in moderation because they're clear about what the different standard drink is and how it should be served, and cocktails, etc. So they all have their own version of how you drink moderately. And this practice of moderation is the key, and that's why wine in moderation is so important. It's why the work that we do through our companies and through our partners about moderation across the whole sector is important, because it's really about, it's about two things. It's about giving adults who choose to drink the information to drink moderately and responsibly, and it's about providing the products as well. And there's been great innovation across all three categories in terms of providing more choice to consumers to drink moderately, including through the innovation with no and low over recent years. So the industry has responded, including through innovation, in ways that do give consumers more choice, and giving them the information to make those choices is also important, and the companies have played an important role in that. And one of IARD's standards is around the information that the companies provide, including on their labelling. And so the labelling now has a number of agreed sort of symbols that all of the companies put on their labels. So that's about 1 billion or more labels a year, given their production. So providing information to consumers, whether it's through wine in moderation, whether it's through labelling, whether it's through IARD, whether it's through their own marketing and public information campaigns, is a very important part of it.
You are organisation, Programme for Action. You are lobbying and protecting the wine industry for possibly further damage from the headwinds buffeting it. Is there anyone left taking a stance on the benefits of moderate alcohol consumption, apart from people like Laura Catena, who happens to be a winery owner and a medical doctor? I remember, Felicity, in one recent podcast, I think it was, you mentioned the fact that it was increasingly hard to find medical professionals who were not retired, who were willing to speak on the record about the benefit of alcohol consumption. Or is alcohol consumption always bad?
So no, it's not. There are It's absolutely not. And what we know about alcohol is very confounded. The research is actually extremely poor. For example, we don't have any research on the differences between types of alcohol, and we don't have any research on how it affects you over time. Like if you drink a lot when you're younger, how it affects you later, and so on. There was a study done in 2008 in the United States called the MUC trial, the Moderate Alcohol Cardiovascular Health Trial. And unfortunately, it got shut down. And the two lead researchers for that were pretty much defamed as a result of their work. They were dragged through the mud, particularly in the New York Times. And unfortunately, as a result of that, it's left scientists and doctors running for cover. Nobody will speak on the record any longer unless they're retired. Since the Surgeon General came out and declared that there should be cancer warnings on alcohol, there actually have been a number of YouTubers and doctors who go on YouTube and have Substacks who've taken it apart. There was one called Vinexposium, who's an oncologist on YouTube, and he went to town for more than an hour on how bad the science was behind this. So if you get the right person who's annoyed enough and they have a social media audience, you might get it, but it's actually very hard to get doctors to talk.
IARD's position and that of our member companies is that we do not recommend that people drink alcohol for its potential health benefits, and we don't take positions on what the science says. But I think what we are looking at is who is really examining the science and who's doing it rigorously and thoroughly, and as part of a US regulatory process called the US Dietary Guidelines, which is ongoing, a number of studies have been done that actually are trying to look at the evidence overall. And one was done by something called the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. It's a very prestigious public science organization in the United States. And they did a rather thorough survey of all of the scientific literature up until last year, and they published, transparently all of their methods in terms of the methodology in which they were actually going to review all of this. They published the results of that in December, and that, it's a very serious, long and complex report. There was a committee of 13 qualified academics and doctors who sat on the panel that reached the findings that this report came to. But to summarise, and I hope I don't oversimplify, but their basic point was that for those who drink moderately, those people live at least as long as people who don't drink at all. And they actually went through rather more precisely for women and for men, and they looked at different diseases and the impact. But that was their broad conclusion, which, again, putting it rather simply, is saying that despite all of the individual one-off pieces of research that you may have read about in the New York Times, when you look at it all in context and you look at the methodology that each of these pieces of research were carried out according to, and you control for that methodology, the overall conclusion is really no different from what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So, what they say is actually the science hasn't changed. Now, that's very different from what you read about in the New York Times every 2 weeks. But that's why you have to go back to, when you have to, cutting through the noise to serious scientific organizations that are actually looking at this. And this organization's done the most thorough review of the evidence. There isn't, that argument that the science has changed and what it says is there's no safe level, which is what you read about in the New York Times every couple of weeks. These people looked at that and they actually said, that's not what the science says.
If Nadia? I may add to that, so wine moderation, since the very beginning, we've based everything we do and everything we say on the latest scientific evidence. And for that, we work with an independent network of scientists, which is called the Wine Information Council, which basically supervises everything we do and say. So whenever we come with a new set of information, we always make sure that it is double-checked and verified and that it is scientifically accurate. We don't take a stance either on whenever a new, piece of research has been published. However, we do ask the network in question to tell us and to help us navigate all this information. And I will add that there also is linked to this network a database that is publicly available online, which is called the wineinformationcouncil.com website, which I also invite you to take a look at. It is updated on a monthly basis, and it has all the latest data about wine health, lifestyle, and everything. And also, the Wine Information Council is organizing for the second time a scientific conference, which is called Lifestyle, Diet, Wine and Health Congress. And I'm going to do a little bit of publicity here. It will take place in March, from the 27th, 28th of March, 2025 in Rome. And the aim is to give a platform to the scientists to discuss all the latest research. And it's not only about wine and other alcoholic beverages, it's really to put this in a larger frame, because it's not only about the ethanol, it's about the lifestyle that we have. It's about the diet. It's about how we live our lives. And this has an impact on our bodies as well.
Yes. So you could be the champion of the industry.
Well, hopefully.
Hopefully, yes.
We certainly need some. I've got a very unfair question, which I'm not going to direct at the two of you, because I realise there's only that much hassle I can put you through. So this question is purely for you, Felicity. With the US saying that they are going to leave the WHO, obviously that's going to mean less money for them. But is that going to change their attitude regarding alcohol, or not at all?
No, not at all. And it will make no difference to the US either in terms of this. What's really important is that none of this is being driven by the public health lobby. They have been actually not very effective over the years. There's something happening in the culture anyway, with the rise of wellness influencers and the rise of, biohacking in Silicon Valley. And the public health people are surfing off the back of it, which they actually acknowledge themselves. They're amplifying something which is already happening in the culture. And so, even if the US withdraws all its money, the WHO can still be heard from anywhere in the world. So it doesn't matter whether they're funded by, well, I mean, it matters to them, and I'm sure it matters to them a lot. But it won't stop their message being heard and being amplified inside sections of the US media. As we're seeing that anything about alcohol and lifestyle at the moment is getting huge traction and amplification. Yes. So it's actually all amplifying each other.
Okay. Still, I mean, you mentioned earlier that you were a diplomat for 13 years. So what is the best way? What would be the best way? What is the best way to influence the WHO?
Well,
what's in your toolkit?
So, the WHO is an intergovernmental organization. Its mandate is established through this treaty that the member states have ratified, and its instructions are given to it through the governance bodies of the WHO, which are made up of the member states. And so every year, the World Health Organization, which is the 192 countries, will vote on resolutions, and those establish the mandates for the WHO. So the mandate for the WHO in the alcohol and health sphere is the 2010 UN strategy to reduce harmful consumption of alcohol. That's the mandate they're working within. It's explicitly about focusing on the harmful use of alcohol. And only when member states agree a new mandate should the WHO and its actions and its policies and its advice to member states change. That's why this meeting in September of the high level meeting in New York on the prevention and control of non-communicable diseases, which includes alcohol and health, is so important, because in a way that is a review of this UN strategy. There will be an outcome document, as they call it, which is basically a UN resolution, which will either confirm the existing strategy, the one I was talking about earlier, focusing on the harmful use of alcohol and the whole of society approach, or it will start changing it. And once that gets changed, if the member states all agree, and it's done by unanimity or by consensus, if they say, actually, no, we think there's no safe level and we think commercial terms of health, then that starts changing that originally agreed mandate. But it comes down to the member states, ultimately. We've heard about how the WHO may be pushing for particular things, but ultimately, the WHO's position is not officially that there is no safe level, actually. That was a position taken by a number of WHO officials writing in The Lancet in January 2023 in a personal capacity, because the official WHO position is the one that was established by the member states, which is they are focusing on tackling the harmful use of alcohol. So that's why these multilateral processes are so important, and why ultimately it comes down to the member states.
So that's the WHO, but there is around us all this kind of global conversation about alcohol. So maybe that's a question for you, Felicity, again. How has that global conversation evolved, say, over the last 10 years?
So the really big thing that changed everything was COVID. COVID changed our relationship with government. So during COVID, governments took powers for the benefit of health, which they had never taken to themselves before. Yeah. But so not only did that happen, but it made normal humans think a lot about health and mortality in a way that they hadn't before, and to demand more action from governments. And so there's this huge upswing of interest in wellness. I mean, and part of what's happening with the media, and the reason that you're reading about the harms of alcohol all the time, is because their readers are interested, and their data scientists can say, look, this article, this article performed really well, so let's do another one. And so every time the New York Times runs a negative story about alcohol, it performs extremely well, as you can tell by the thousands of comments, and so quickly they come out with another one. The other thing actually is that we're all living longer, and now we've got ageing demographics, and governments are, I was going to say something rude. I won't say they're crapping themselves, but they're kind of crapping themselves about how to deal with this, because the longer people live, the more expensive they get. And so, you're starting to see a lot more conversation, not just about alcohol. You're starting to see conversations about processed foods and all sorts of things, and it's all part of the same sort of dynamic that's going on.
Slightly controversial, you say that since COVID, consumers, people, want to see more action by governments. But isn't there also a group of people who have seen what government did during COVID and who are saying, never again, we don't trust you, that was too much or too little, and I've lost faith in the voice of government?
This is another problem, this breakdown of trust in science and expertise. And you can see this very clearly around conversations around food, where the conversations move way beyond what the science says. And I think it also, there's some public health research which is being published in April, where a group of public health researchers went around the world and talked to young people about their views about health and alcohol and so on. And they found that young people were really, really sceptical about capitalism. And so it feeds into this idea of the commercial determinants of health, which is that alcohol companies and food companies and so on are out to get you. They're out to do you damage for their own profit. And that's something that sectors of the public health have understood very well. They've understood that one of the ways to get people to stop drinking is to actually say you're a victim of big alcohol. So there's lots and lots of things which are feeding into this at the moment.
So that's another sort of maintaining the truth and keeping a tab on acceptable and proven facts is also part of your remit, as part of your program for action?
So, it is really important to that's what my science team does, is to be able to cut through the noise and actually really track what's going on. And there is, because this has become so politicized, you have to be able to get beneath that and look at those organisations that are pulling this together in serious and methodical ways. As I say, the National Academy did their study. There's something called the Global Burden of Disease Survey, which is a very important annual survey, very respected, run out of the University of Washington. The Institute of International Health Metrics and Evaluation is the body that does that. So there are organisations that do work to pull this together in a sort of methodical and scientifically rigorous way. And those are the things that we look to give us the guidance on what the science is saying. And ultimately, as I say, it's not for the companies to decide these things. It's for governments. It's for these international processes. But we believe that if those processes are really evidence-based policy-making processes, then that will confirm the policies that we're pursuing at the moment, and won't actually confirm a shift in those policies, because we think when you go through to the evidence and look at it objectively and get the studies that have been done scientifically and rigorously, the evidence says the existing policies based on the existing sort of intellectual foundation, which is tackling harmful use, based on the existing processes, which is to involve all of the stakeholders, including the private sector, those are the ones that work.
Okay. So if we look at industry-led self-regulation, look at the Portman Group, for example, in the UK. They've done sterling work in avoiding, basic things like packaging appealing to children and stuff like that. But that's very much industry-led. So is there still room for organizations like that? Or do you think that increasingly governments will take over and industry-led initiatives will dwindle because governments will decide everything?
There needs to be a combination. We absolutely support proper statutory frameworks. All of the evidence shows that if you can have a proper statutory framework that prevents underage drinking, properly enforced, if you have proper statutory frameworks that prevent drink driving, properly enforced, those things have significant impact on alcohol harms. Yeah. And we support those, and those should be statutory, and they should be enforced through the law. What we've done, for example, as IARD, since 2018, when the UN at its last big UN meeting on non-communicable diseases in 2018 called on the industry to take concrete steps to eliminate the marketing and sale of alcohol to minors. We've basically, as IARD's companies, and we've had, I think, a sort of a multiplier effect across the industry and across the value chain, have focused on online marketing and online sale, which is where a lot of marketing and sale has moved in recent years. And we developed some digital guiding principles that all of our companies signed up to, and they implemented those through their contracts with digital marketing agencies, through their contracts with online platforms, through partnerships that we've done with Uber Eats, with e-commerce platforms, Google, Meta, etc. So the age gating is now widespread across the internet. And so is opt-outs for alcohol marketing, for those who want to opt out. These are things that have been driven by all of the resources that this global industry has put into its marketing and its sales in order to prevent the sale and marketing to those underage online. And that's what the private sector can bring, and we did it because the UN asked us to in 2018. And it's one of the things we're saying in New York as we talk to member states in advance of this meeting later this year is, you asked us to do this. This is what we've done.
And we
hope you think that this has actually really delivered something that governments or the civil society wouldn't have been able to do, because we've brought all of the resources of the industry to bear on it. Task us again, because we do want to be part of this whole of society approach.
Nadia?
Yes, I want to add to that, because since the very beginning of wine and moderation, we've also had a self-regulation code, which is called the Wine Communication Standards. Anyone who joins wine and moderation commits to respecting these standards. And these come in addition to national legislation, so they complement basically national legislation. We recently also updated our code to include information on digital media, and also give guidance on how to communicate about moderate and responsible drinking through all the social media channels, all the while respecting specific guidelines. So this is very important to us as well, and we believe it works.
I think that's maybe one of the fields in which you can have the edge, because governments are notoriously slow in adjusting to changing mores and ways of life. And we see it all the time where they're, scrambling to legislate because people have died or something's gone terribly wrong, but they go, yes, it was a new technique, we didn't know about it. And I think by being ahead of the curve, you can actually say, hey, we're doing your job for you, but we're also helping, and we are more nimble than a government. Is that a fair comment, or am I just praising you?
I mean, I think the companies in IARD are very sophisticated companies. They have very sophisticated marketing. Yes, they're commercial entities that are selling products to people. I mean, as we've discussed earlier, there is no conflict of interest between wanting to sell to people who will consume moderately and being absolutely committed to tackling harmful consumption. But marketing has changed dramatically in the last few years, as we've seen both things have gone online, but also social media influences now play such a huge role. So, and all of these companies are adapting very quickly to that and learning by doing so. But we have also developed social influencer standards. So standards that the companies now implement in their contracts with marketing agencies that use social influencers, for example. This is the frontier of marketing, and our companies are at that frontier, and they can put in place, and through IARD we've done this across our companies, guidelines that allow us to ensure that if we're using social influencers, that there are, we've got rules, we've got processes, we're clear that they should have age gating as well, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole set of criteria that we've developed, which our companies are now are baking into their contracts, and they spend serious money in this, which is actually shaping this whole area of marketing overall, because these companies are big players in that sphere.
Ahead of the curve. So, elephant in the room. Could you define moderate consumption for me? Because we keep on coming back to this idea of moderate consumption. What is moderate consumption? Is there a definition?
Well, what we say at Wine and Moderation, we have, let's say, two messages. The first one is, choose whether or not you want to drink. And when you choose your beverage, choose wisely, choose what makes you happy, choose quality over quantity. Always share it. So don't drink alone, share it with your friends, your family, share it with food, always with a glass of water.
So you actively recommend food consumption with alcohol?
Absolutely, and water as well. So it's a group. It's a group of, you should always appreciate it together, and then care, because by caring about yourself, you will automatically care about your surrounding and the people around you. Now, we also give drinking guidelines based on scientific evidence. And again, these are drinking guidelines that are confirmed by the scientific body, which is the Wine Information Council. And what we say is...
So what are the
up to 2 drink units a day for women.
Yeah.
And when I talk about a drink unit, I talk about 100 ml of a wine of more or less 12% degree alcohol. Up to 3 for men, and never more than 4 in any occasion.
Okay.
And then obviously there are certain people who should avoid drinking wine and other alcoholic beverages. And there are situations in which these beverages should be avoided. So, for example, drink and drive when you're taking medication, when you're operating machinery and such. And the final thing we say is that whenever you're in doubt, always check with your doctor, because we are not physicians. We give general guidelines, but then it's up to you. Take your responsibility and double check.
So our website basically says more or less the same thing, which is, there's 2 components. One is the, as we've been discussing, the practice of moderation, which is, how do you consume, how do you, consuming with food, staying hydrated, etc. So that's one element. The other one is, what is the quantity per day, per week? And that's, the truth is those are defined quite clearly in different countries, and they vary a bit, but broadly speaking, they're fairly aligned, whether it's in the US or the UK or other markets. That's the fundamental point about public policy in all of these countries, is that governments provide national guidelines within which that can be defined as basically moderate consumption and therefore low risk. And we obviously support those national guidelines in all of the countries where our companies are operating. But that idea that you have national guidelines is based on that fundamental policy point, which is you can distinguish between harmful consumption, excessive consumption, and moderate consumption. And many sophisticated countries go through their processes to define what those guidelines are. The US has them at the moment. The National Academies of Science said that if people consume within, though they defined moderate consumption as the current US guidelines, and they basically said if people consume within those guidelines, then you have you live at least as long as if you're as a non-drinker. So it's a number of elements. There is no global definition of what it is. I think that'd be very difficult to achieve because this is a national competence. But as I say, there's quite a lot of alignment. We've seen advisory processes have suggested quite radical departures from that definition of moderate consumption. We saw a Canadian advisory process which advised a dramatic redefinition of what moderate consumption was. That was not taken up, which is an interesting story in and of itself. And we'll see what happens in the US process. Ultimately, our companies will obviously support whatever the national guidelines are in any particular market. But that's where this interesting debate is now taking place, and where there are people who are trying to push quite a radical change in what the definition of moderate consumption is.
Yeah, so we're very far from a litre a day.
Very far.
Do you want to add anything to that, Felicity?
No, I think that was covered really well.
Good. To finish on a light note, there's two ways to look at the young generation. One is a negative way to say they don't understand, they don't love wine, the culture, they're teetotal, waste of time. There is a positive way to look at it and to say they actually possibly understand moderation better than the previous generation. And, they are the future. So could we say that maybe they're doing your job and one day you won't have to work on moderation because the population will have sorted it out?
I think there will always be work, but and I'm not saying this in a negative way. I'm saying that there is always room for education, whether it is new professionals working in the market or new consumers, young adults, but also emerging markets. So
yes, emerging markets are really important. So you've got work to do for the years ahead.
Looking forward to it.
And you, Julian?
So, as I've come into this industry, I've sort of looked at the history, and this is an industry that goes back a long way, thousands of years. These products have been produced, obviously, for a huge amount of time. And some of the companies that are members of IARD sort of curate brands that are hundreds of years old and claim to be able to produce them in the same way as they've been produced. So these are, I think we're living through a particular time. I think people there will be challenges with harmful consumption of alcohol, as there have been for thousands of years. And I think there will be, way into the future. I do think also that people will be consuming moderately for a long time to come. We lived through a particular period, but when you look at the history of this sector, it goes back thousands of years, and I think it will continue for thousands of years too.
Excellent. I think there's a quote I found the other day which made me smile, which said, well, if wine was good enough for the Son of God, it's good enough for me. I think that was very apt because, in this industry, we love the product and we've got to make sure that it's not abused, consumed moderately, so that it can thrive for many years to come. On this positive note, slightly optimistic, on behalf of Vinexposium, I would like to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule during the fair and for talking to me. And I hope you have a very successful Wine Paris.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you.